Maxwell Reed stood at the window of his cramped studio apartment, watching snowflakes dance against the darkening December sky. The heat barely worked, and his breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. His phone buzzed again, another reminder of the mounting bills he couldn't pay. The hospital expenses from his mother's cancer treatment had wiped out his savings. And now, at 32, he was drowning in debt. The knock at his door wasn't unexpected. They'd been coming more frequently, debt collectors usually. But when he opened it, instead of the usual stern-faced man in a cheap suit, he found an impeccably dressed woman with steel-grey eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Mr. Reed." Her voice carried the polish of old money. "I'm Victoria Blackwood. May I come in?" Maxwell hesitated, acutely aware of his surroundings. The peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the general air of desperation that seemed to cling to everything. But Victoria Blackwood was already stepping past him, her Louboutin heels clicking against the worn hardwood floor. "I'll be direct," she said, removing her leather gloves with deliberate precision. "I have a proposition for you, one that could solve all your financial problems." Maxwell's throat tightened. He'd heard about these types of offers before, usually involving illegal activities. "I'm not interested in anything illegal." Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and cold as the winter wind outside. "Nothing illegal, Mr. Reed. Just a marriage contract." The words hung in the air between them. Maxwell stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. Victoria Blackwood was probably in her mid-40s, striking rather than beautiful, with the kind of confidence that came from having never heard the word no. "Marriage," he finally managed. "A temporary arrangement," she clarified, pulling a thick envelope from her designer handbag. "1 year, starting immediately. In exchange, I'll pay off all your debts, including your mother's medical bills. Additionally, you'll receive a monthly stipend of $10,000 for the duration of the contract." Maxwell's mind raced. The amount would change his life, give him a fresh start, maybe even help his mother get the experimental treatment her doctors had mentioned. But the whole thing seemed absurd. "Why me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why would someone like you want to marry someone like me?" Victoria's smile tightened. "My reasons are my own. Let's just say I need to be married by Christmas for business purposes. The arrangement would be strictly professional. We'll live separately, and you'll have no claim to my assets or company. When the year is up, we'll divorce quietly, and you'll walk away with enough money to start a new life." She slid the envelope across his rickety coffee table. "The contract is inside, along with the first payment to show my good faith. Take tonight to think it over. I'll need your answer by tomorrow morning." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Oh, and Mr. Reed, this conversation never happened. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, the offer disappears, along with any chance you have of paying those medical bills." After she left, Maxwell sat in his cold apartment staring at the envelope. Inside, he found a contract and a cashier's check for $50,000. His hands trembled as he read through the terms, the requirements, the constraints, the confidentiality clauses. Everything seemed legitimate, if bizarre. He called the hospital later that night, inquiring about his mother's bills. The total had grown to nearly $200,000. The experimental treatment would add another $150,000. Numbers that might as well have been millions, given his current situation. As midnight approached, Maxwell sat at his window again, watching the snow build up on the ledge. He thought about his mother's brave smile when he visited her, how she pretended not to notice when he brought her the same sweater for Christmas 3 years in a row because he couldn't afford anything else. He thought about the debt collectors, the final notices, the constant gnawing fear in his stomach. Then he thought about Victoria Blackwood's cold smile and colder eyes. There was something she wasn't telling him, something beyond business purposes. But did it matter? Could he afford to care about her true motives when his mother's life hung in the balance? Just before dawn, his phone rang. Victoria didn't bother with pleasantries. "Have you made your decision, Mr. Reed?" Maxwell watched the first rays of sun paint the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would sign her contract, save his mother, and then spend the next year discovering exactly why Victoria Blackwood needed this marriage so desperately. And when he found out, he would make sure she regretted ever walking into his apartment with her pristine smile and her devil's bargain. "Yes, Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice steady. "I'll sign." Will Maxwell discover Victoria's dark secret before it's too late? Watch until the end to witness the shocking truth that changes everything. The wedding was a cold affair, much like the December morning it took place on. No friends, no family, just Maxwell, Victoria, and a jaded-looking judge who'd seen too many marriages of convenience to care anymore. Victoria wore a tailored grey suit that probably cost more than Maxwell's entire wardrobe. He wore the only suit he owned, the one he'd bought for job interviews that never panned out. "The papers will need to see something more conventional," Victoria said afterward, her heels clicking against the courthouse marble. "We'll have a proper ceremony next week, small but elegant. My PR team will handle the details." Maxwell nodded, already feeling like he was drowning in this new reality. The cashier's check had cleared, and his mother's medical bills were paid. The hospital had even fast-tracked her for the experimental treatment. He should have felt relieved, but instead, he felt like he'd just stepped into a trap whose teeth he couldn't yet see. The proper ceremony turned out to be at Victoria's estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a sprawling mansion that made Maxwell's apartment look like a storage closet in comparison. As he stood in the guest room, where Victoria's staff had deposited him, he caught his reflection in an antique mirror worth more than his yearly salary. He barely recognized himself in the custom tuxedo they'd forced him into. "Mr. Reed?" A soft knock at the door revealed Sarah Chen, Victoria's personal assistant. Unlike her employer, Sarah's smile reached her eyes, though there was something nervous about it. "Mrs. Blackwood wants you to join her in the study. There are some people you need to meet before the ceremony." The study was like something out of an old money film, all dark wood and leather-bound books. Victoria sat behind a massive desk, flanked by 3 men in expensive suits. Maxwell recognized one of them from financial magazines, Charles Winston, CEO of Winston Global Investments. "Ah, the lucky groom," Charles said, his smile sharp as a shark's. "Victoria's told us so much about you." The lie hung obvious in the air. Victoria hadn't told them anything because there was nothing to tell. This was a business transaction, nothing more. "Maxwell!" Victoria's voice carried a warning note. "These gentlemen are members of the board. They're here to ensure everything goes smoothly." The way she said it made Maxwell's skin crawl. He studied the men's faces, noting the barely concealed disdain in their eyes. Whatever game Victoria was playing, these men were either willing participants or obstacles she needed to overcome. The ceremony itself was a masterclass in deception. 50 carefully selected guests, all presumably in on the charade, or too wealthy to care. Victoria played the role of the besotted bride perfectly, her performance so convincing that Maxwell almost believed it himself. Almost. It was during the reception that he caught his first real glimpse behind the curtain. He'd stepped out onto the terrace for air, the weight of his new gold wedding band feeling like a shackle, when he overheard a conversation through the partially open French doors. "It's desperate even for Victoria," a woman's voice said, thick with wine and mockery. "But I suppose she had no choice after Richard's will stipulation." "Shh!" another voice hissed. "She'll hear you. Besides, it's brilliant if you think about it. The board can't touch her position now that she's happily married. Poor Richard. Though barely cold in his grave." Maxwell's heart pounded. Richard, Victoria's late husband, he assumed, the man whose death had been mentioned exactly once in all their interactions, when Victoria had clinically informed him that she was recently widowed. The next morning, Maxwell moved into the east wing of Victoria's mansion, a condition of their contract that she'd insisted on for appearance's sake. His mother was transferred to a private room in the best hospital in New York, with round-the-clock care. Everything was falling into place exactly as Victoria had planned. But Maxwell had plans of his own. He spent his days learning the rhythm of the house, noting who came and went, which staff members might be willing to talk. Sarah Chen, in particular, seemed like she might crack under the right pressure. She carried herself like someone bearing the weight of secrets she wished she could unload. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Maxwell made his first significant discovery. He'd been exploring the mansion while Victoria was at work, another thing she'd forbidden, which only made him more determined to do it. In a locked drawer in the library, the lock being no match for the skills he'd learned during his less fortunate years, he found a copy of Richard Blackwood's will. The document confirmed what he'd overheard at the wedding. Richard had left Victoria controlling interest in Blackwood Industries, worth billions, with one condition: she had to be married by the end of the year following his death. If she failed to meet this requirement, control would pass to the board of directors. It explained the rushed timeline, the need for secrecy, but something about it felt off. The clause was oddly specific, almost vindictive. What kind of man would put such a strange condition in his will, and why? Maxwell's investigation was interrupted by his phone ringing. It was the hospital. His mother's condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Victoria already there, speaking in hushed tones with his mother's doctor. She looked up as he approached, her face unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Your mother is my family now, Maxwell," she said loudly for the benefit of the nurses nearby. Then, in a whisper, "Remember our arrangement, keep your emotions in check." But as Maxwell watched her walk away, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. She'd stopped at the nurse's station, exchanging words with a nurse who looked strangely familiar. It took him a moment to place her. She'd been at the wedding, not as a guest, but hovering in the background, just like she was doing now. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Victoria wasn't just monitoring him. She was monitoring his mother. The question was, why? What could she possibly gain from keeping tabs on a sick woman? Unless his mother's sudden downturn wasn't as sudden as it appeared. Maxwell felt the first stirrings of real fear, followed quickly by rage. He'd agreed to play Victoria's game, to be her puppet husband, but he'd never agreed to put his mother at risk. If Victoria thought she could use his mother as leverage, she was about to learn exactly what kind of man she'd married. Two could play at this game of secrets and lies, and Maxwell had nothing left to lose. What do you think Victoria is really planning for Maxwell's mother? Share your theories in the comments below. Maxwell spent the next week playing the perfect husband in public while methodically piecing together Victoria's past. His mother's condition had mysteriously stabilized after his confrontation at the hospital, confirming his suspicions about Victoria's involvement. The fake nurse disappeared, replaced by staff he'd personally vetted. His first real breakthrough came through an unlikely source: Victoria's housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez. She'd worked at the mansion for over 20 years, maintaining a careful distance from the family drama. But one evening, while Maxwell was helping her with a heavy box of files headed for storage, something she noted the late Mr. Blackwood would never have done, her careful facade cracked. "You're not like them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe that's why she chose you. Maybe she's trying to make things right this time." This time, Maxwell kept his tone casual, though his heart raced. Mrs. Rodriguez glanced nervously over her shoulder. "There was another before you, another young man about your age, David Foster. He worked in the company's legal department. After Mr. Blackwood died, he and Mrs. Blackwood grew close, but then..." She stopped abruptly as footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sarah Chen appeared, her face tight with anxiety. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Blackwood requests your presence in the study immediately." Maxwell found Victoria standing by the window, backlit by the setting sun. She held a glass of scotch in one hand and a manila folder in the other. "Interesting afternoon?" Her voice was silk over steel. "I hear you've been quite helpful with the household staff. So unlike your usual routine of investigating my personal affairs." Maxwell's face remained neutral. I wasn't aware helping the housekeeper was against our contract. Don't play coy, Maxwell. We both know what you're doing. She turned, fixing him with those cold grey eyes. But since you're so interested in the past, let me save you some time. Yes, there was another man. Yes, he died. Car accident. Very tragic. And yes, it happened shortly after Richard's death. I'm sure the timing seems suspicious to someone of your background. She tossed the folder onto the desk between them. Inside were surveillance photos, Maxwell meeting with his mother's new doctors, speaking with hospital administrators, even one of him picking the library's lock. Did you think I wouldn't be watching? Victoria's smile was glacial. You signed a contract, Maxwell. Break it, and your mother's new treatment becomes unavailable. Amazing how quickly experimental programs can fill up. Is that what happened to David Foster? Maxwell's voice was steady, despite the rage building inside him. Did he threaten to break his contract too? Something flashed across Victoria's face. Not guilt. Exactly, but something close to it. Before she could respond, Sarah burst into the room, her normally perfect composure shattered. Mrs. Blackwood, it's the board. They've called an emergency meeting. Someone's been leaking documents to them, financial records, emails. Everything. Victoria's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. What documents? Everything about David Foster, about Richard's accident, about the changes to the will. Sarah's voice cracked. They're saying they have proof the will was altered, that Richard never added the marriage clause. Maxwell watched Victoria's carefully constructed world begin to crack. For the first time, he saw real fear in her eyes. She turned to him, accusation written across her face. This was you. No, he said honestly, but I'm starting to think someone decided to finish what David Foster started. Victoria grabbed her phone, furiously dialing numbers, but Maxwell wasn't paying attention to her anymore. He was watching Sarah, who had gone deathly pale, her hands shaking as she clutched her tablet to her chest. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Sarah Chen, the perfect assistant, always in the background, always watching, always taking notes. Sarah, who had access to everything, every file, every email, every secret. Sarah, who had worked closely with David Foster in the legal department. How long? Maxwell asked her quietly. Sarah's eyes met his, and he saw years of pain and guilt there. David and I were engaged, she whispered. We were going to leave together, expose everything. Victoria found out, the night of the accident. It wasn't an accident. Victoria's phone call ended abruptly. She'd heard every word. You stupid girl, she snarled, all pretense of sophistication gone. After everything I did for you, everything I protected you from, protected me from? Sarah's voice rose hysterically. You protected yourself, just like you protected yourself when you killed Richard. The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing. Maxwell looked between the two women, seeing the truth written in both their faces. Richard discovered what you did to the company, Sarah continued, gaining strength. The embezzlement, the fake accounts, all of it. He was going to expose you, so you had him killed, then forged the will to maintain control. You needed a husband quickly, someone desperate enough not to ask questions, but David figured it out, didn't he? Just like Maxwell was starting to. Victoria's hand moved to her desk drawer. The one Maxwell knew contained a gun. But before she could reach it, the study doors burst open again. Charles Winston stood there, flanked by two police officers. Hello, Victoria, Charles said grimly. I believe we need to have a conversation about Richard's death. Maxwell watched as Victoria's world collapsed around her. But even as the officers moved forward with their handcuffs, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was too neat, too convenient. Victoria might be going down, but he'd learned enough about power and wealth in the past months to know that the truth was rarely so simple. As if confirming his thoughts, he caught a glimpse of Charles Winston's face as Victoria was led away. The man wasn't shocked or disturbed by these revelations. He was satisfied, like everything had gone exactly according to plan. Did you see that shocking revelation coming? Hit like if you knew Sarah was hiding something bigger, and subscribe to never miss our next thrilling story. The media circus that followed Victoria's arrest was exactly what Charles Winston had wanted. Maxwell watched from the sidelines as the story exploded across every major news outlet. Wealthy widow arrested for husband's murder. The salacious details of their marriage contract only added fuel to the fire, painting Victoria as a desperate woman who'd do anything to maintain control. But something about Charles's satisfaction nagged at Maxwell. He'd seen that same look before, on Victoria's face, when she thought she had everyone exactly where she wanted them. 3 days after Victoria's arrest, Maxwell received an unexpected visitor at his mother's hospital room. Richard Blackwood's former secretary, Margaret Wells, was in her 70s now, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "I've been waiting to see if you'd figure it out," she said, settling into the chair beside his mother's bed. "You're cleverer than the others, I'll give you that. But you're still missing the bigger picture." Maxwell studied her carefully. "Why are you here, Mrs. Wells?" She pulled out an old envelope, yellowed with age. "Because Richard Blackwood was a good man, Mr. Reed, and before he died, before he was murdered, he left this with me. Instructions to open it if anything happened to him and Victoria ever remarried." Inside the envelope was a letter and a USB drive. The letter was short, written in a hurried hand. "To Victoria's next husband, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've been drawn into a web that was decades in the making. Victoria isn't the spider at the center of it. She's just another fly like I was. The real predator is Charles Winston. He's been orchestrating everything since before I took over the company from my father. The embezzlement, the fake accounts Sarah found. Those weren't Victoria's. They were Charles's, hidden so well that when I finally discovered them, I couldn't prove anything without implicating myself. Victoria discovered the truth too late. Charles had already trapped her, using evidence he'd fabricated to make it look like she was behind everything. He threatened to destroy her unless she played her part. The marriage clause in my will was his idea. He needed a way to either control the company through Victoria or remove her completely if she became a liability. On the USB drive, you'll find everything I managed to uncover. Bank records, offshore accounts, evidence of Charles's involvement in multiple corporate takeovers. He doesn't just want Blackwood Industries, he wants an empire built on the ruins of companies he's systematically destroyed. Be careful who you trust. Charles has people everywhere. Richard Blackwood. Maxwell's hands shook as he read the letter again. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Margaret's face was grim. "I tried after David Foster died, but Charles's influence runs deep. The detective investigating David's accident disappeared for 3 days. When he came back, he closed the case. No one would listen after that. And Sarah, is she part of Charles's plan too? Sarah Chen is exactly what she appears to be, a grieving woman seeking justice for her fiancé. Charles is simply using her pain for his own ends, like he uses everyone." Maxwell thought about Victoria, sitting in jail, taking the fall for crimes she might not have committed. He thought about his own role in all this, another pawn in Charles's elaborate game. "Why tell me this now?" Margaret stood slowly, her arthritic joints protesting. "Because you're different, Mr. Reed. You weren't chosen for your desperation alone. Charles picked you because of your past. The skills you learned surviving on the streets, the connections you made, he thought those same qualities would make you easy to manipulate and then discard. But he doesn't understand that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who have nothing left to lose." She walked to the door, then paused. "Victoria isn't innocent, Mr. Reed. She made her choices, but she also tried to protect you in her own way. Those nurses watching your mother, they weren't monitoring her. They were protecting her from Charles's people. Victoria knew that if you became a threat, Charles wouldn't hesitate to use your mother against you." After Margaret left, Maxwell sat in the growing darkness of the hospital room, listening to the steady beep of his mother's heart monitor. The USB drive felt heavy in his pocket, laden with secrets that could destroy multiple lives. including his own. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dinner tomorrow night? We should discuss your wife's situation, Charles." Maxwell stared at the message, remembering Victoria's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "Remember our arrangement. Keep your emotions in check." He'd learned more than Charles realized during his months in Victoria's world. He'd learned how the wealthy and powerful operated, how they wielded influence like a scalpel, cutting away threats with surgical precision. He'd learned that sometimes the best revenge wasn't swift or violent. It was patient, calculated, and served cold. Charles Winston wanted to have dinner? Fine. Maxwell would attend. He would play the part of the confused, grateful husband, relieved that his wife's crimes had been exposed. He would let Charles think he was just another pawn. But this time, the pawn was going to take down the king. He typed out his reply. "Thank you, Mr. Winston. I would be honored." Then he began to plan. The truth about Charles Winston left us speechless. Who do you think is the real villain in this story? Victoria or Charles? Let us know in the comments. The private dining room at the Monarch exuded old-world luxury, all mahogany panels and crystal chandeliers. Maxwell adjusted his Brioni suit, a gift from Victoria that now felt like armor. Charles Winston sat across from him, swirling an obscenely expensive Bordeaux in his glass, while Manhattan's lights twinkled behind him. "You know, Maxwell," Charles said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "I've always believed that crisis reveals character. The way you've handled this situation with Victoria, impressive. Most men would have crumbled under the scandal." Maxwell maintained his carefully crafted expression of humble gratitude. "I'm just trying to protect what's left of the company's reputation, Mr. Winston. And my mother's treatment, of course." "Ah, yes, your mother." Charles's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "How is she doing? I hear there was some concern about her continuing the experimental treatment, given the circumstances." The threat was clear, wrapped in a velvet glove of false concern. Maxwell took a slow sip of water, buying time to control the rage that threatened to surface. "The doctors are optimistic. I'm grateful the board has allowed the treatment to continue." Of course. We take care of our own." Charles leaned forward slightly. "Which is why I wanted to discuss your future with Blackwood Industries. The board and I have been talking, and we believe there's an opportunity here. Victoria's shares will be in limbo during the trial, but as her husband, you have certain rights." Maxwell noted the slight emphasis on trial. Charles was testing him, seeing if he'd flinch at the reminder of Victoria's situation. Instead, Maxwell pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "Actually, I've been reviewing some interesting documents," Maxwell said, keeping his tone casual. "Old financial records, board meeting minutes, some fascinating correspondence between various parties." Charles's hand stilled on his wineglass. "Oh? It's remarkable how much information accumulates over the years. People forget what they've signed, what they've written." Maxwell withdrew a single page and slid it across the table. "Like this memo, for instance. From you to the board of Winston Global, dated 2 weeks before Richard Blackwood's death, outlining a strategy to acquire Blackwood Industries through a hostile takeover if necessary." The color drained from Charles's face so subtly that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Maxwell had spent months studying the tells of the powerful. "Where did you get that?" "The same place I got the offshore account records showing the real money trail behind Blackwood Industries' embezzlement scandal. Funny how all those transactions lead back to shell companies owned by Winston Global subsidiaries." Charles's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator beneath. "Be very careful, Mr. Reed. You're playing a game you don't understand." "On the contrary," Maxwell smiled, channeling Victoria's Arctic elegance. "I understand perfectly. You've been playing this game for decades, haven't you? Identifying promising companies, infiltrating their boards, creating internal crises that force them to accept your help. Richard Blackwood discovered your pattern, but by then it was too late, so you eliminated him and set up Victoria to take the fall." "Interesting theory." Charles's voice was dangerous now. "But theories need proof. And proof has a way of disappearing, along with the people who try to expose it. Like David Foster? Maxwell pulled out his phone, showing Charles the screen. Or like Detective Michael Sullivan, who so conveniently closed the investigation into David's death. He's been very chatty lately, now that he's dying of cancer. Guilty conscience, I suppose. He recorded all your conversations, Charles. Insurance, he called it. Charles's composure cracked further. What do you want? Originally, revenge. Victoria manipulated me, used my mother's illness as leverage. I wanted to destroy her. Maxwell's voice hardened. But then I discovered you, the real spider in this web. Victoria was cruel, but you're a monster who's spent years destroying lives for profit. You have no idea what you're doing, Charles hissed. One phone call, and your mother's treatment will continue exactly as planned, Maxwell interrupted, because at this exact moment, everything I've discovered is being delivered to the FBI, the SEC, and every major news outlet in the country. Your empire is built on paper, Charles, and paper burns. Charles lunged for his phone, but Maxwell held up a hand. Oh, and don't bother calling your cleanup crew, the ones watching my mother. They work for me now. Amazing how loyal people become when you show them evidence that their boss set up their previous employer for murder. The restaurant's door opened and 2 FBI agents stepped in, followed by Sarah Chen. She looked different now, stronger, more determined. Sarah, Charles's voice cracked. What have you done? What David would have wanted, she replied. What Richard Blackwood tried to do. Maxwell showed me the truth, all of it, the evidence Richard gathered, the real reason David died. We've spent months building this case, making sure every detail was perfect. Charles glanced around wildly, looking for escape routes. This is absurd. You're nobodies, a grieving secretary and a man who was broke 3 months ago. You really think you can take me down? Maxwell stood slowly, adjusting his cuffs, a gesture he'd learned from Victoria. That's the thing about being nobody, Charles. People don't see you coming. The FBI moved forward with their handcuffs, reading Charles his rights. As they led him away, Maxwell caught a glimpse of Margaret Wells sitting at the bar, raising her glass in a silent toast. Later that night, Maxwell visited Victoria in prison. She looked smaller somehow, without her designer clothes and carefully crafted armor, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. I heard about Charles, she said without preamble. Quite a performance. I learned from the best. Maxwell sat across from her. Richard's letter explained a lot. Why you chose me, why you tried to protect my mother in your own twisted way. Victoria's face softened almost imperceptibly. Richard was a good man, better than I deserved. When Charles showed me the evidence he'd fabricated, making it look like I'd killed Richard, I should have fought harder. Instead, I played my part, became what everyone already thought I was, a ruthless widow who'd do anything for power. It was easier than admitting the truth that I was just another victim of Charles's games. She met his eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maxwell. What I did to you, to David, those were my choices. But Charles needed to pay for what he did to Richard. Maxwell slid a document across the table. The real evidence, clearing you of Richard's murder, has been submitted to the DA. You'll still face charges for your role in David's death and the corporate fraud. But with Charles's manipulation coming to light, Victoria stared at the paper, then back at Maxwell. Why? After everything I did to you? Because Richard was right. You're not the spider. You're just another fly who got caught in the web. The difference is you survived. Maxwell stood to leave. The board is restructuring. Once the dust settles, Blackwood Industries will need leadership that understands both sides of power, the light and the dark. Someone who's learned from their mistakes. And my marriage clause. Maxwell smiled. Funny thing about that. Since Charles forced the fake will, our marriage was never legally necessary. The divorce papers will be ready next week. He was almost to the door when Victoria called out, Maxwell, that night we met, did you ever wonder why I chose your apartment building? Out of all the desperate people in New York. Maxwell turned back. Richard's letter mentioned something about my past, my skills. Your mother, Victoria said softly. She worked as a nurse at Blackwood Memorial Hospital for 20 years before she got sick. She took care of Richard in his final days. He told me about her son, about how she'd lost everything, paying for her cancer treatment. He made me promise to help her, if I could. Maxwell felt the weight of this final revelation settle over him. All this time, he'd thought he was just another pawn in Victoria's game. But even her choice of him had been orchestrated by Richard Blackwood's final act of kindness. "Goodbye, Victoria," he said finally. "Try to be better this time." "Goodbye, Maxwell, you already are." 1 month later, Maxwell sat in his new office at Blackwood Industries, the Manhattan skyline spread out before him. His mother, now in remission, had moved into a comfortable apartment nearby. Sarah had been appointed head of legal compliance, ensuring the company's dark days stayed in the past. And somewhere in a federal prison, Charles Winston was watching his empire crumble, piece by carefully constructed piece. Maxwell picked up a small package that had arrived that morning. Inside was a single chess piece, a pawn that had made it to the other side of the board. The note with it read simply, "Sometimes the most powerful moves come from unexpected places. V." He placed the piece on his desk, a reminder that in the game of power, it's not about where you start, it's about how far you're willing to go to protect what matters. And sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about becoming strong enough to rebuild what they tried to destroy. What would you have done in Maxwell's position? Would you have shown mercy to Victoria after discovering the full truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did true justice prevail in this story? Let us know how you feel about Maxwell's ultimate revenge plan. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss our next incredible revenge tale waiting for you on the left side of your screen. Trust me, it's just as gripping, with twists you'll never see coming. Don't forget to hit like if this story touched your heart, and subscribe to join our amazing community.